related to what's new in COVID-19. Fast forward to 2021. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the vaccines, which everyone is very interested, but also on some of the new treatments that are out there that people should be aware of, some of the issues around testing as well, and of course, a little bit about the new variants that are out there. So just to start, except I can't advance my screen. Oh, here, let me try this. There we go. So just to review again, we're looking at the COVID-19 disease that is caused by the RNA virus named SARS-CoV-2. And just to recall the picture of this virus, it is an RNA gene code encapsulated by protein. And what I wanted to point out were these spike proteins, which of course are very relevant both to the development of therapeutics as well as specifically to the vaccines that are being developed. And then the symptoms most commonly are fever, dry cough, shortness of breath, and fatigue. But unique to this virus is the loss of taste and smell. But it can also look just like influenza: headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle aches. And so it's very difficult to differentiate between influenza. It is inhaled into our lungs, and there the virus begins to replicate, and it can initially cause pneumonia, but in very severe cases can cause a lot of inflammation and destruction of lung tissue, as well as heart and kidneys. So just to compare it to the flu we haven't seen this year because of our social distancing and mask wearing. But one of the major differences is how infective it is. So that one person with flu is expected to infect one other person. Whereas COVID, one infected person infects 2 to 2.5 others. And with the new variants, we're seeing more like 3 individuals infected from one case. The incubation time in the flu is from contact with a person with flu. By 4 days, you're showing symptoms. But COVID is challenging because it can take a full 2 weeks before a person who's contacted a COVID case develops symptoms. And in that time, spread of illness happens. And then, of course, the hospitalization rate is much higher, as is the mortality rate. The other unique thing about the COVID vaccine are the long haulers. These are individuals who continue to have symptoms: fatigue, breathlessness, chest pain, headache, long after they've cleared the virus from their system. It's expected that at 1 month post-infection, 13% of people will have these ongoing symptoms. And at 3 months post-infections, 4% will still be affected. I had a nurse in the other day who is 3 months out, and she was a very athletic young woman who was running every day, and she is having trouble walking around the block and is not able to return to work due to fatigue and breathlessness. So it is more common with older age and underlying disease, but the severity of your illness does not dictate who will be long haulers, nor does your age specifically. So this is a disease you do not want to get, because you do not know if you're going to be a long hauler. The good news is 98% people survive, 80% have mild to moderate symptoms, 20% require hospitalization, and nowadays there's about a 1% mortality. The number of people who have the illness and are shedding virus but do not have symptoms is 15 to 20%. And that's the challenge of COVID, is trying to identify these people before they spread the disease broadly. The other interesting thing is in households with a person with COVID, it's very hard to avoid the illness yourself. Upwards of 25 to 50% of household contacts will get COVID. Again, the case fatality rate, the number of deaths, is clustered in the older age group. If you're 80, there's a 15% mortality rate, 70 to 79, 8%. And that's why the vaccine is targeted at these individuals to prevent lives lost. Comorbidities, other diseases also make a big impact on the death rate: obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, lung and heart disease, etc. However, even though the number of the seriousness of the disease is highest for the older age group, the actual numbers of cases are clustered in the 20 to 40-year-olds. And so if you have a 1% mortality rate and you have 500,000 people in this age group with the disease, you are going to see deaths in those groups as well. I'm going to skip this slide. So race also has been shown to influence the death rate. And it's not only because of perhaps underlying genetic predisposition, but there's also all the other social factors that go into it. In Hawaii, although Pacific Islanders only represent 4% of the population, they account for 30% of the cases and 16% of the deaths. And part of it is because you're living in crowded households, people have lost their jobs, families are moving in together. You've got the adults going out to work and probably hospitality, etc., possibly bringing the illness back into the house, and then the elder members of that household become sick and some pass away. So this is where we really need to consider how we roll out the vaccine, and we've had some discussions about this. In terms of treatments, as I said, most people do recover, even if you do have underlying illness. Normally, how the disease progresses is that at 5 days after exposure, you're getting the cough and the high fevers. And then about 8 days is when people really crash and the fevers become unrelenting, the headache, the body aches, and then the shortness of breath because the COVID pneumonia is starting to develop. And 20% of the cases will develop this. Again, many go on to recovery, but unfortunately, at about 11 days, those who are really suffering with lung inflammation end up in ICU, and this is the group that does suffer the most. So our treatments are actually geared to each of the phases of disease. So obviously the vaccines are the first thing to shut it down, prevent you from getting COVID at all. In the early infection stage, the first 10 days of the illness, when the virus is replicating in your lungs, there is a new treatment of monoclonal antibodies that is given by IV, and it is to reduce the amount of virus in the body, therefore in the hopes of reducing the risk of developing pneumonia, getting hospitalized, and getting severe disease. So this is something, if you test positive, we do have it here in Hawaii, you need to ask about this antibody infusion to prevent serious disease. When it's in the lungs and you've got the pneumonia, then there are different treatments used. And these are often the hospitalized people. They are getting the antiviral treatments. Remdesivir has been shown to reduce the length of hospitalization, even though it is traditionally used for other viral illnesses. The other medication that has been shown to reduce the death rate is dexamethasone, which is a very common steroid. We use it for kids with croup, and it has a huge role in the pulmonary phase to reduce the amount of inflammation in the lungs and stop the destruction of lung tissue. And then for those who end up in ICU and then everything is thrown at them to try and reduce the cytokine storm, this inflammatory process that is destroying lung tissue and heart tissue. And this is where you use interleukins, there's the ventilators that are being used, etc. So I talked a bit about the antibody infusion. It is for those who are not hospitalized but are at high risk of COVID disease. The earlier it's given, the better, because we're trying to reduce the amount of virus. It takes about 3 hours, the whole process, and it's based on these risk factors: older age, obesity, underlying lung disease, diabetes, kidney disease, and it is used in kids. We actually had a kid today, 12-year-old, who had the infusion, did quite well with it. So in terms of testing, again, we tend to test when people have symptoms, but what we really want to catch is the asymptomatic cases. And this has been very challenging. The tests that are used are the nuclear test, or the PCR, and this is considered the most accurate test. Initially, it was, taking 72 hours to get the results, and in some states even longer. But now there are the rapid DNA tests or RNA tests that can be available in 4 hours. And if they're positive, you're very likely to have COVID. If they're negative, we still need to look at your symptoms and decide if another test is needed. The antigen test for protein fragments that are COVID, and this can be a saliva or a nasal swab. The results are very quick, but it's not as accurate a test. A negative test does not rule out COVID infection. And this is the tests, or this particular type of testing is what the Biden administration has put aside $230 million, I believe, to develop home test. Sorry, let me go to that. That will be available at home. They're using the one called Illumina, and it is something you can do at home and get a with a $30 test, get an accurate or an assessment of whether you have COVID. It avoids the long lines that people are faced with. It avoids many of the challenges of waiting for test results way beyond when it's of use. But of course, it is costly and it won't be available for everybody. And then, of course, the vaccinations. So there's over 120 vaccines in development. The different types of vaccines. The traditional type of vaccine is a whole inactivated virus. This you're familiar with the polio vaccine, in which the virus COVID is inactivated and then injected, and your immune system develops a response to that. Now, the Chinese version is the out of the Sinovac lab. They're using this in China. The other extreme is the newer technology of mRNA vaccine, in which a piece of the code, the genetic code for the protein in the spike protein, is encapsulated in a lipid capsule and injected into the body. And then another newer type of vaccine technology are the viral vector technologies. And that's where genetic material is encased in an adenovirus, which is a typical cold virus. And that is the means by which it's injected into the body. So in terms of the messenger RNA, we've got that gene code encapsulated that's injected into the body. It goes into the cell, and then the manufacturing process of our cells, the ribosomes, pick up that gene code and they start to make protein. And it is the spike protein that is made. It's released. Our immune system cells recognize the virus, this as a foreign invader, and start to mount antibodies against this spike protein. So when a COVID virus enters our body, our antibodies cells see the spike protein on the outer reaches of our coronavirus, and it then neutralizes the virus, so it can't infect us. So a comparison of the current COVID vaccines that are out there. The Moderna and the Pfizer are the RNA viruses. They do require 2 injections. They are extremely effective, way more than most vaccines we've ever had before. But with that comes a challenge, and that's the cold temperatures required to keep them stable, because the RNA virus is not a very stable thing. And then the cost is also high, $33 per dose, so $66. So good for the United States, maybe not for good for our low-income countries of the world. And then the viral vector ones are the Oxford AstraZeneca, which is actually being manufactured in India as well as in the UK and elsewhere. The Sputnik is from Russia, and the Johnson & Johnson has been submitted for approval in the to the FDA and will be with us shortly. So these ones aren't quite as effective. The variability is still under study. In the Johnson & Johnson, where we have had a little chance to look at some of the data, even though It prevents 70% of the virus or the illness, meaning 30% of people probably will get COVID infection with this virus. There were no hospitalizations, so therefore no serious illness and deaths in the study group. And so just like the influenza virus or vaccine does not say you won't get flu, but it reduces the risk of hospitalization and the risk of death. So it has its role, and its big role is the one shot and the cost. In fact, they're looking at $4 a shot for use in the developing countries. And then the inactivated virus is the one from China. It's variable in terms of its effectiveness. We don't really have a lot of data to review. In Brazil, it was considered 50% effective, and the cost is very variable depending what country you live in. So the safety concerns, everybody wonders how could they have been made so fast? But the research behind this has been going on for at least 10 years. When SARS-1 first came out, they were looking at this type of vaccine. And with pouring lots of funding and lots of hard work into the warp speed, and by overlapping the various trials, so the clinical trials for safety, the small group to initially assess it, the larger group to look for safety, and then the phase 3 trials where 100,000 participants were involved to look for true safety before it was submitted to the FDA. And finally, while the phase 3 trials were going on, they ramped up the manufacturing capabilities. So they were ready to go with millions of vaccines as soon as approval was granted. Again, just to emphasize, the Pfizer and Moderna were not only in Caucasians, but some of the trials were done in South Africa, some in Brazil, trying to reflect the demographics of North American society, and in different ages. Pfizer was down to 16 years of age to 85, and Moderna was 18 to, I don't remember the oldest, in their 70s. And the other thing that is important is the virus cannot give you COVID, or sorry, the vaccine cannot give you COVID-19 because it doesn't contain any virus. It's the spike protein gene that enters our body, not the virus itself. So it can't alter our DNA. And the RNA is very unstable, which is why those ultra extreme temperatures, and it decays in a few days in our body. And with the 100,000 people, there were no serious safety concerns, and we're continuing to monitor these vaccines. So it's safe up to age 85, different ethnicities, very strong immunity within 14 days of the second dose, not after the first dose. And individuals with underlying illness were included. Not studied yet in children less than 12. They're beginning the trials in children 14 to 16, and then they'll go down to like 12 to 14 and continue to check for safety. In pregnant women, there were some that were pregnant in the trials. It has been safe in animal models, and the Society of Obstetrician Gynecologists is actually encouraging women to consider getting the vaccine because COVID in a pregnant woman is a very life-threatening disease. It was never studied with people with anaphylaxis, and that means a drug reaction where the lips and tongue swell and breathing problems start. And there have been some, I think 21 cases of anaphylaxis in all the millions of vaccines that have been given in the US to date. And so that's why the vaccine centers are equipped to deal with that. And the trials will be continuing to follow for 2 years to ensure that they continue to show safety. To compare the viral vector vaccine to the RNA vaccines in terms of the side effects from the vaccine, most are within 36 hours. Some go on for 3 to 4 days. Arm pain is definitely a biggie. Some people do develop fever, with less than 2% having a very high fever. Headache is a very prominent side effect, and the fatigue. Most people do note fatigue from it. But generally, a bit of Advil or Tylenol takes care of that. And the good news is the older you are, the less severe the side effects from the vaccine. So this is with the Moderna and with the Pfizer, and severe side effects were very rare in this group. And after the second vaccine is where most people did have side effects. So everyone's interested in where am I in the timeline. So I'm going to present this graphically. We're well into 1A, having immunized many healthcare workers, and long-term care facilities are being immunized by Long CVS and Walgreens. They're getting the Moderna. So we're into the 1B, and that's what's been happening since January. And the 1B are the individuals who are the first responders, the corrections officers, teachers, as well as 75 plus. And the way they're doing the essential workers, frontline essential workers, is the state is looking at the infection potential that these people may be exposed to, and calling those individuals in based on that. 1C, they're expecting maybe in March to roll out, and those are the 65 plus and people with comorbidities. And then finally, hopefully by June, we'll be able to roll it out to other people. But there's also always the potential that the vaccines may be redistributed when there are clusters or outbreaks, and also priority groups may be targeted. And that's where we were talking about perhaps the groups that have been most affected in our community, like the Pacific Islanders and the Filipinos in clusters. So how do you get a vaccine? So Hawaii Pacific Health is vaccinating at Pier 2 and Loa Tower, 75-year-old and essential workers, and Queens is vaccinating at Blaisdell. For people with Hawaii Pacific Health, there's a MyChart app that you download, and this will allow you to book the vaccine. It'll also give you a message as to when you're due for the vaccine. If you're not affiliated with Queens or don't have MyChart, then Hawaii COVID-19.com vaccine allows you to book a vaccine. And these areas, these two places are open to anyone. They don't have to be affiliated with a particular hospital. The website, hawaiicovid19.com, has phenomenally good information on vaccines, on everything COVID. I strongly encourage you to look at it. It also allows you to book the appointment. And there is a call center, but of course, that's always very busy too. Beware of vaccine scams. You cannot jump the queue by paying money. So never give out your SIN number or be fooled into being on a list in return for money. So the big question, when will life return to normal? Dr. Anthony Fauci says that if 75 to 85% of people in the United States are vaccinated, this coronavirus will be behind us. And then comes along the new variants. So the three variants that are being tracked, there are many variants out there, but the ones that are being tracked are the ones in the UK, which has been shown to be much more infectious, though they do not believe it causes more serious disease. The one in South Africa and Brazil, there's a little bit more concern that it may, because of mutations in the spike protein, be able to evade the vaccines that we are using to fight this epidemic. However, at this point, the field of vaccines will be somewhat effective, maybe not quite the 95%, but if they're 70%, that's going to be good enough to shut it down. Viruses constantly mutate, so the concern are about these mutant, vaccine mutant escape viruses, and active study is going into it to see how effective they are. In Brazil, there has been a little bit more concern because we're seeing reinfection of people who've already had COVID-19. So more to come. So the thing to do is shut it down here. If we vaccinate, we fail to allow this virus to replicate into an uncontrolled spread. So if we shut it down here, that person can't infect 3 others, et cetera, et cetera. So please spread the word to vaccinate. And then along with this, we still need to be vigilant about reducing community spread, especially with these new variants, avoiding crowded situations, close physical contact, enclosed spaces, restaurants, etc., for the whole time. So, worldwide vaccine access. We also need to think globally, because as we've seen from the variants coming in from South Africa and Brazil, if we don't immunize globally, we're not going to beat this because it will just mutate. So COVAX has been formed, which is affiliation between the World Health Organization, Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations, which is really funded partly through Rotary funds, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations. So the CEP are supporting vaccine research and development, and they're actually supporting the Oxford AstraZeneca platform in India that's being developed. The Gavi is going more for going to the vaccine manufacturers as a pooled country and acquiring vaccine. So the purchasing power is much stronger when the participating countries are together, and coordinating the diagnostics and treatments as well to reach these vulnerable populations. So you can see there are more than 92 low and middle income countries that are part of this COVAX participants. And as I mentioned, Rotary is also involved, and also is created an infrastructure in these countries through the Global Polio Eradication Initiative to also help with COVID identification, vaccination, and reaching the most vulnerable people in the world. So to end, the pandemic, unfortunately, is still surging. So we have to work in multiple ways to shut this down by maintaining our good public health practices, by vaccinating widely, postponing travel, and protecting our high-risk groups. We will get through this. Thank you. Hello. So,
thank you so much.
Questions, comments?
Peter Stern, we were just talking about the fact that there are already talks about getting booster shots in order to help stop the variants. Is that true? Have you heard anything about that?
From the beginning, they looked at whether it would be good to have the RNA shot and then back it up later with availability with the viral vector shot, because you're attacking the virus from two different arms.
Right.
And so at this point, I mean, we're still trying to get the first vaccine into people's arms. I think they're up to 5 million people a day in the United States. So
Wow.
we are moving forward.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think what was it, 23 million have been vaccinated in the United States, but that's 230 million people. So we've got a ways to go.
Right. Thank you.
Nancy, do you have any comments on, anybody else know anything about the,
No, I've heard multiple comments on that and read possibly 3 months for a second vaccine, possibly a year. So it's really in the investigative process right now.
Claire, this is Jonathan McRoberts on Kauai. Do you know have my chart? Will they allow me to go in there and get put on a waiting list? I'm 72.
you should be eligible for the vaccine now. So what happens in the state of Hawaii is the vaccines are flown in on Thursday. And so the vaccines are set aside to ensure that people get their second vaccine in a timely fashion. And then the rest are opened up for first-time appointments. And they are not doing waiting lists, unfortunately, because I'm only speaking from HPH. I'm not sure about the other availability. That would be through the Hawaii COVID-19 vaccine platform. But my understanding is waiting lists are not happening. So it's frustrating. And this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to reach people who don't have reliable internet, who don't have
Mhm.
even phones. So we need to think about how we're going to equitably distribute this vaccine in our state. But keep trying.
Mhm.
So you said, I'm 72. You're saying I could go on there and get one now, get an appointment?
Yes. Oh,
Oh.
sorry, you're 72. I was thinking you
72,
were
I-
75.
No, if you're
I'm a
75
I'm a
in this
very old
year.
72.
So what they're supposed to do, what they're supposed to do is to send you a message when it's open up for the next group.
Okay, thank you.
So we're looking at March, they're thinking.
Are you doing anything about the anti-vaxxers?
Mhm.
It's
We'd like to.
challenging.
Well, that's why we're doing the information session, because there's a lot of misinformation in the community. I just read some today that was just astounded me. And that information is circulating. And truthfully, if 25% of people are not going to get it, but 30% of the people are on the fence, we need to get those 30% that are on the fence vaccinated so we can get to our critical level of 72, 75, 80%. So we could try to get the anti-vaxxers. I think, I don't know this for a fact, but maybe what will happen in the future is you can't get on an airplane without the vaccination. You can't get on a train. You can't get on a bus. You can't. So that may definitely sway people. And I also read something today is, will it be required for everybody to get it? Again, that was, they couldn't say that at this point. But I think the pressure would be great if you want to go any place and you have to get on a public transportation, and that's a requirement. That may send a lot of anti-vaxxers into the vaccination mode. Sorry,
That's a
Claire.
brilliant idea. No, I think that's a brilliant idea. I know the other thing is, because these vaccines are actually emergency use authorization,
Mm.
they're still under study. People have the right to say, no, I'm going to wait
Yeah.
and see. And I have seen that even in the healthcare profession. People are
Yes.
waiting to see how people react.
Well, and just a little background. So I've done the first pneumonia vaccine in the world. That I did it here in Honolulu and translated everything into 13 languages, and it was a huge operation. But what I noticed was what I had to have on site as the physician in charge is I had to have a Japanese person, I had to have a Chinese person, I had to have a Korean. Because I cannot speak as a white person to those people that are not white. Why would they listen to me? So this has become a major issue in some of the African American communities. I just heard about it in Chicago, where a number of healthcare workers are not going to get it, that are African American. And that is the group that we really need to get vaccinated, truly. Anyway, 10 cents on that.
So in our meeting today on the vaccine, the stat was shared that I think came out earlier today. 91% in Hawaii are willing to get vaccinated. So we're very fortunate here with our population here. And we've done pretty good about just managing COVID overall. So lucky we live Hawaii. I'm originally from North Dakota, not so much so there. So I'm glad I'm not there right now. And we talk a lot in our meetings. So I was on the communications meeting and talk a lot about getting the information out there in different languages. So we currently have it in 16 languages, and we plan to spin it up to 31. So I'm on this committee, and anybody here, you guys are the, you're on the ground. If you have feedback or anything that you'd like me to relay, let me know. DOH is at these meetings. Feedback that we're getting is folks that are going to Pier 2 and going to Blaisdell, it's going very smoothly. So when people sign up, the feedback we're getting are people are very happy with the process and how we get there. Naomi put out that we have some people that are doing data entry from our Rotaries. and helping out. So they're very eager to kind of get this right. The issue has been, as you know, and you haven't addressed this here, it's the supply that's been
Right.
more of the issue. The second issue is getting it to the far reaches, like Waianae and even in some of the rural areas on the other islands. And that's a lot what we've spent our last 4 weeks talking about, how to get it out there further to more people. And real creative kind of ideas have come up. But what we run up against is before I came here, I'm on the board of directors for Hawaii Meals on Wheels, is HIPAA and getting information out about these folks. And I'm mental health for many years, so I'm also concerned about guardianship and having actual legal guardians make sure that they're part of the decision. And then Dr. Balazs can certainly talk about Alzheimer's as being another issue. So, informed consent and all of those things. But so put that out there. I have a question though, kids. How are we gonna vaccinate kids without the research? I mean, what's the plan on that? I mean, anybody here know? I mean, it doesn't come up. I'm in the Kapuna world, but it is a concern I have because they're kind of the spreaders, yeah.
Well, no, actually,
No.
the 20 to 45-year-olds
Nope.
are the
Okay,
spread.
thank you.
And the
Just baiting you.
Yeah, no, they're not.
Sorry.
Sorry. And the other issue is that we know that the kids that are in the schools with all the proper protocols put in place are not getting the virus from the schools. They may be bringing it in from the households, but they're actually a lot safer in the schools. They, because they have to follow the rules. And so, I mean, we do want to protect our teachers, particularly those who are more vulnerable, but there are, of course, children who do get very serious illness, but the vast majority of them bounce back. And that's one of the reasons they're looking at these at-home testing. There's actually a spit test that's on a little piece of paper, and it's not particularly accurate, like compared to the PCR tests. But if you could do it every day, because it costs pennies, I mean, that's something that families could do at home. Some of these home tests, a little bit more complex, but again, that could be something that is done in schools to identify early infections. Anybody else know anything about kids? And
No, I think they're just beginning to study that now.
Yeah.
I just had something before and we're not ready to conclude yet, but wanted to make sure that I mentioned this, is, as Rotarians, what can we do? And there were 5 of us on a call prior to this that had this first discussion and made the decision to go ahead and have this education seminar for folks. What can you do? And we have made a determination, I think we made the determination that we're going to let at this point, the community health centers, Waimanalo, Kali'ipalama, Waianae Comp, the community health centers manage the COVID vaccinations. But what we can do is the education part, just like this. I mean, at least we can do this very well and then make decisions what we can do as our next step. And I think if each one of us asks 3 or 4 people next time to join one of these, now you have it's just like the picture that you showed, Claire, of how we get COVID. It's how we prevent COVID. So if I ask 10 people and you ask 10 people, we'd now have 100 people on this call. And those 100 people could ask 10 more and get 1,000 people. And I think this eventually will filter through the community, and those people who are on the edge are going to look and go, wow, Claire got it. I mean, Dell got it, and they're still alive, and Naomi got it, and Sandy got it. So, I mean, I think that's how we're going to make a difference as Rotarians just at this moment. And I think we find out other ways we can help transportation, whatever else we're going to do.
I'm hoping I grow some hair from it, but I know